We're going to go ahead and get started now. I have my ID. It's so geeky. Hi, I'm Tammy Ray Carland. I chair the undergrad photo program here at CCA, and I'm going to give our formal gratitudes right now, so just bear with me because I'm going to read this. First of all, this is the Larry Sultan Memorial Lecture Series, so welcome. This lecture and all the lectures affiliated with this series are co-presented by the California College of the Arts, Pier 24 Photography, and San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Support for the Larry Sultan Visiting Artist Program is provided by Robert Mailer Anderson, Nicola Miner, Randy and Bob Fisher, Nyan McEvoy, the Black Dog Private Foundation, and Pier 24 Photography. So Charlotte Cotton's going to give a talk tonight, and we have a few special people who are going to come up and introduce Charlotte. So I would like to welcome to the stage 3 of our esteemed undergraduate photography majors here at CCA, Graham Hollick, James St. Clair, and Eva Jabot. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. So Charlotte asked us to introduce her today because I guess Jim couldn't be here for some reason, so you get us. Haha. So there's a certain intimidation that goes along with having a new professor who literally wrote the textbook that we've been using for the past couple of years. And so our first day in Charlotte's class, we didn't really know what to expect. But that day we spent literally hours breaking down this one single essay, just bit by bit, analyzing every little piece of information. It was overwhelming, and the prospect of such a rigorous semester like that was kind of daunting. So I went home that afternoon, and I just had the urge to try and apply that same level of analysis to something else. So I just pulled up a random essay that I'd been given a previous semester and just started going to work on it. And a few pages in, naturally, the first person quoted in the essay was Charlotte Cotton. Later on that night, I went out to Tammy Ray's opening, and the first person I saw when I entered the gallery was Charlotte Cotton. Which is to say, Charlotte is someone doing many things all at once, making her mark in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different places. So while that initial intimidation has since dissipated a bit, the reasons behind it have not. Charlotte has held curatorial positions at the V&A in London, Lacma, the National Media Museum, among others. She's the founder of Words Without Pictures and EitherAnd.org, as well as the author of the aforementioned textbook, The Photograph as Contemporary Art. We've been lucky enough to have her this semester. It's been great thus far. And now Graham and Eva are going to share some of their experiences with Charlotte.
Hey, everybody. I'm Graham Hollick, and this is my last semester at CCA, and I think it's kind of the perfect time to be in constant conversation with Charlotte Cotton. I think that one of the things that I've learned in my time spent with her is that I really haven't learned all that much, and that I can always keep learning. I think that we've really analyzed a lot of texts that I've probably been given before but never quite read enough. So if there's anything I've really learned from spending time with Charlotte Cotton is that sometimes when things are hard to read, you should read them 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. Before you really can understand them. Also, that being said, I think I've reevaluated kind of what knowing something is and trying to figure out what really makes up me thinking I understand something and kind of constantly questioning. So going forward, I've been kind of given a gift, which I really am glad that I went to school and I learned. The crucial thing is that you never stop learning and that you should always continue learning. So I am forever grateful for time spent with Charlotte Cotton.
Hi, I'm Eva Jabot. So it's about to get real heavy. One day, while in Charlotte's class, I was struck by an epiphany that I have the materials and friends to create what I want to see in the art world. We are now in a hyper-connected era in which we as young artists and makers have multiple opportunities to create the spaces and projects that we wish to engage with and use as platforms for discussion and revised community building. I have learned that I don't have to rely on traditional methods of networking or traditional institutions that will dictate my post-CCA graduation life, Locally based photographic projects can act as a conduit for international discourse, and artist-made projects can exist in multiple versions. And most importantly, I have discovered that this is an exciting and very, very positive time to be making images when my friends can be my biggest inspirations, and the community that I am a part of is rapidly evolving with all of us into a multimedia, eclectic art form. And this is what I have learned from being in class with Charlotte Cotton. And now, with great pleasure, I would like to introduce Charlotte Cotton.
When Jim told me he wasn't going to be able to make it this evening to introduce me, I was a bit of me that was really sad that Jim wasn't going to come up and just mess up an introduction again for us all. And so I thought I would ask my undergraduate group that I've been working with I left them in the room for an hour at the end of last week to work out who was going to come up. And I'm really touched, you can tell I'm really touched that being here has meant, well, it's meant as much to you as it has to me. I hope there are many times in this lecture that you recognise the conversations that we've had in class, and you know how much you've helped me to shape ideas about photographic culture. Being able to develop my ideas in the context of a classroom has been central for me for the past 8 months, actually. I'm in here now, but I was also teaching as a visiting scholar at Parsons and SVA last semester. And I'm hoping that I can continue this really stimulating, if rather peripatetic life for at least another year after this. I genuinely cannot think of a better way for me to exist right now, not least because of the caliber of the ideas that I'm experiencing in the classroom. The reason for me to teach right now is very closely aligned to my reason for curating my vocation. I mean, the basis of curating, I think it's about making things. It's a very simple act. You make things for other human beings. And I write as a curator. I'm not an academic. I don't really seek the approval of what might constitute my peers from the outside. I don't think I'd write anything if they were the reader that I imagined. I write as I think about. As I write, I think about the sense of the reader, and the reader is someone who I'm crafting ideas for, whose reviews I actually seek, and who I think my writing could be really useful for. The first time I did that in relation to teaching and writing was in 2002-03, when I took a year out and taught at the University of Sussex, and I taught art history students. And at the end of that year, I wrote The Photograph as Contemporary Art. I could not have written that book without actually being in direct contact and in conversation with the people it was for. And so tonight I'm going to talk about 2 book projects, one called Photographic and the other called Photography is Magic, which are in my mind now and sort of imminently about to come out. The context, I want to tell you a little bit about the context in which I arrived at CCA. And arrived at this, what I consider this very current phase of my life. I arrived really through some, I think, probably very necessary personal disappointment. It's kind of fine to say that, because I think it's actually a small miracle that I managed to get to age 40, having thoroughly enjoyed practically every day of my working life. And also feeling that it was very clear and very straight path of what I wanted to do. So it's not really a surprise at midlife that it would be a time to review and to rethink and to know what's working and what's not working. The first realization concerned the seeming enduring pyramid of cultural institutions. And I mean seemingly enduring. I don't think there's a kind of fully rounded alternative to the fact that collections remain at the top of the pyramid for institutions, permanent and temporary exhibition spaces and galleries remain the kind of most hot property that all of those different fiefdoms in a collecting institution vie for. And publishing, learning, and live events are considered often these sort of ancillary or sort of supplementary activities. And throughout the 20 years that I've been working mainly in museums, I have to say that the publishing, learning, and live events has been the area where I've had the greatest fun and the greatest creativity, or by supplying the very, very cheap photographic exhibitions in a large museum. But I suppose it stopped working so effectively for me a couple of years ago. For one reason, that guerrilla tactics isn't really a very good look for a 40-year-old. And secondly, that it seemed, more than that, in all seriousness, it just seemed that this structure wasn't going to be the structure that could properly reflect creative practices as they are developing at this moment. There was another force at play, a much larger one, and I suppose one which is the consequence of photography becoming contemporary art over the last 15, 20 years. So this entity of photography as contemporary art is under the same sort of gravitational pull or the sort of polarization that's happening within this very overstretched term of contemporary art. I know which side of the equation I align myself with. I like artists whose work I'm working with to be alive, first and foremost, and ones who are very conscious of the way in which they're informing cultural life. I don't really want to work with artists if they consider themselves suppliers of products for the art market. And really there's no meaningful role for me within that market orb. I've said many times in different contexts that I think contemporary art photography has become much more specific in the last few years. No longer is it the case that cultural space is the default space for singly authored photography. It's not even the site for every iteration of an individual practitioner who would call themselves an artist. It's not really the site for every one of their expressions either. The art market and the practices of photography cross over to produce some of the most fantastic works of art, but it's a slim crossover. And these I think, are the problems that increasingly I was finding by working full-time in institutions. I couldn't adequately deal with it. I couldn't be useful in that situation. So I did myself what I think kind of sort of management teams called SWOT analysis of my situation. And I suppose I was thinking, well, I think these were really the sort of broad terms I had to think about. What could I do on my own? What would be single authorship? What would I participate in? What could I participate in? And in that I include all of my work in museums. It's a participatory act. I mean, you're delusional if you think you're producing anything with single authorship while working in a museum. And then also the other line is, where can I stay constant in my processes? Where can I continue to do the things that I want? And where do I go to learn new things and new ways of doing them? It helped me really think through the big distinction that now I need to make, which is the difference between my labour and my work, which I think a lot of people in a recessionary time are dealing with, is the idea that it's not psychically it's not safe to leave your work with your employer. What happens when you don't have an employer? You have to own your work. So it's been a really great couple of years, and teaching has very much been part of that, where I've really respected my work and the work that I want to do. And I will be demanding and expect fair treatment and terms and conditions for my labour, the things that I can do and somebody can pay me to do. My kind of fantasy, I must point out, I was never invited to be head girl or head of class or anything like that at school. So I have these little fantasies. I think that's why I quite like being a school teacher, of being in charge. And so my idea of a big thing, so my ideal situation is in that corner with participation and continuity. But I've come to see that as like the fantasy job, the job that doesn't exist, and I should be really cautious when I get overexcited about something that I think is my fantasy job. And I suppose teaching at CCA is my fun work. Like, I really own it. Like, I feel it is part of my practice to be teaching at the moment. But because it is so participatory, it truly is my fun work. There are some precedents for the way that I think I am working at the moment. Things that I call my grown-up curatorial strategies, and some of you might know them. So Words Without Pictures was a website project and then a summary book published by Aperture, which was one of the first times that I suppose I moved towards seeing that my role could be one is much more to create a framework rather than be the single voice of a set of ideas about photography. I won't go into it much detail because I'm sure many of you know it, but it's a lot of really, really thoughtful people, artists and thinkers about photography, being willing to earnestly put out first ideas or new ideas about the direction of photographic practice. It involved working in partnership, which I really loved, with the designer David Reinfurt and the artist and curator Alex Klein, who was working with me at Lacma. And I suppose the loveliness of that is it was very much a transference of the thing that I adored about working at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was the idea of working within something and creating something that was so much bigger than yourself. And Words Without Picture was this very local version of that. I was really touched about Eva talking about doing something local with international resonance, and Words Without Pictures was definitely that for me. That led on to another website, which is still live, I think, called eitherand.org, which is organised by a group called PH Photography Group in the UK, which are about 30 PhD students and candidates and young educators dealing with photography. So really bringing photography into the realm of digital humanities in very new ways, and creating new and commissioning new writing. And these are some of the themes that they've been looking at, like exhibitionism, so asking a question about whether we've moved from a 20th century voyeuristic culture in image-making culture to an exhibitionistic 21st century culture. I've had a few peers in the sense of people I learn and I've learnt from and I admire, but I've met at times which have been sort of, our lives have been on parallel tracks or parallel inquiries. And the person who seemed most resonant for me to shout out tonight in the context of this course is Mark Allen, who is the founder of Machine Project in LA. And Mark has been my friend and my collaborator since 2007, when we started working on what became the Field Guide to Lacma, which was held mid-November 2008, which was a day where 60 artists and performers took over the Lacma campus, which is 20 acres. It was just the most thrilling. It was like creative Tourette's. It was like all the things that you think when you're in a museum, which is absolutely contradictory to what's written on the label text. And there were all of these artists and performers facilitating that experience. I swear to you, those 6,000 people who went to Lacma that day had their antenna switched on to that place, and they had a real relationship with Lacma that day. It was a delight. In 2012, when I was really deciding I wasn't going to work in full-time in museums for a while, Mark invited me to do a residency at Machine Project over the summer. And two really important things happened there for me. One is he and I taught a summer school, a curating live events summer school, a free school. And we were a really great sort of partnership, coming from two very different spaces to this field of curating live events, which for me has a real parallel to the history of photography, that curating live events still isn't owned by or co-opted into one particular discipline. It's not owned by anyone, so you have to come from somewhere else to this field. So, which I think photography was like that in the 70s. You had to come from somewhere else. So it's naturally very, very pluralistic and diverse. So it was really lovely 2 years ago just to be in that experience and realise, yes, I come from photography, but that doesn't mean that I'm sort of I'm bound into a certain modes of working because of the field that I've come through. The second really important thing about the machine residency is it's a really good place to write. And I wrote a piece for the Aperture, relaunch of Aperture magazine, and I really said what I thought. And I know that sounds funny, but when you work in museums for many years, you censor before you actually say that. And it was the first piece that was very well reasoned. It took me months to write, but it was, I think, saying a lot of things that were on a lot of people's minds. I'm back now at Machine Project's apartment, partly because I haven't fared well with the rent prices in San Francisco. And this is the place where I can really map out the next 2 books. There are other projects that shifted my curatorial practice in the last couple of years. I just want to mention a few of them. This is the entrance to the Krakow Photo Month in 2012 in May. And Krakow Photo Month was founded by a group of people in their late 20s, 10 years before then, who did a very, very smart thing, which is there wasn't much photographically happening in Krakow, so rather than berating the institutions, they raised the money, organised exhibitions, and just asked the venues to host this photo month once a year. So super smart people, and they were sort of rethinking it a bit, like what does it mean? They've been around for 10 years. What could the next phase of the foundation and the exhibition program be? And they asked me to come in and do a show in the Kunsthalle in Krakow. And I was like, I think I was very conscious at the time that me coming out of museums, everyone said, oh, you should get yourself a website. And suddenly it felt like I'd need to sort of brand myself. And that just seemed like very, very painful to me. So I said, I don't really want to do a show of, you know, me spot checking a few emerging photographers. Why don't I be a mentor curator to you? Like, the things I have learned over the course of my career about is how to use low conning, how to change things from within, how to restructure in such a way that it really can reflect what it is you want to do. So they did invite me to be, and they called me the mentor curator, and we did a show called Photography in Everyday Life, which is the title of the manual that you would learn about photography in Poland for like 40 or 50 years, which, because of the political regimes, it couldn't actually talk about photography, couldn't talk in pictures about photography's capacity to bring about social change. So it was all of these sort of weird Christopher Williams-y looking sort of bowls of fruit and men with antlers in this book. So the first room was literally just dissecting that book and looking at how that introduction to that book had been rewritten under different political regimes. But we did tons of stuff, you know, it was like undergrad art history students set up the first oral history of Polish photography, and we had a massive blackboard the length of this lecture theatre, and educators would come in and pin up and say over the history of photography in Poland. So that was like, the history was written during the length of the show. It was a delight. There are other projects. I worked quite a bit with 2 young guys who set up Tent in Greater Manchester with £200. They have set up an organisation which is like a new camera club for Greater Manchester, and they're doing really, really well. Weirdly, Manchester is one of those places that there hasn't been much sort of photographic culture, but there's a lot of photographers and graphic designers. So just learning how to use my skills and to help other people do other things and not worry too much about where that leaves my authorship. It's a real pleasure to be that useful in new situations. And in early June this year, I've been co-curating a show with 2 young curators in Madrid for Foto España. Some of you might know the festival, which this year is dedicated to Spain. So we've decided to work with 30 artists who are curating the show with us. And we had a 3-hour phone call yesterday, and we decided to run the live programming while we're installing the show, which is nuts. But anyway, that's what we've decided to do. The recent teaching, this is another, I'm building to the first book. This is all part of it. So in my most recent teaching at Parsons, I was lucky enough to be invited onto the Syllabus group, so redrafting the undergraduate syllabus. And it's really nice if you're just somewhere for a semester, because like you don't have to go through the normal village bartering of, can I possibly join? Would it be possible? It was like, you're here now, so join this. And so I had to was able to sort of immediately join into this restructuring of the syllabus. Probably the most exciting bit for me is in the elective courses, and the idea that you might explicitly offer a training which says a photographer or somebody with a photographic practice can do all of these things, that these aren't separate trainings and they're not separate disciplines. So why not make that explicit? Why not have a course? Why not run a course on the performance of the artist? Why not run a course on curating photography or participatory photography projects, rather than really, I think something which I don't think is even really true is the idea that single authorship of a body of work every 2 years is the standard or kind of organic creative practice of somebody using photography. So this is where I am right now, and therefore that is where I start. And that sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but it's a phrase that I learned from a friend who works in mental health. That's how somebody gets better, or how somebody kind of moves their life on, is you can only start from where you are. You have to get real about where you are. The first book that I'm doing is called Photographic, and actually, no, it's the second book I'm doing, but it's the first one I started really formulating in my head. And it's a book that will be published, I decided, in installments in 2015. As you might expect, who it's for has been set from the very beginnings of the concept. And who it is for me at 22, and lots of people at 22 who are making choices about to what extent they want to go into debt, or to what extent the entry points are into having a sustainable creative life. So my thinking started when, so I was back in the UK for a few years, and as you might have heard, there was a wholesale privatisation of higher education in recent years, and suddenly we had to face the same, we are facing, it is a fact, that the fee structure is pretty much equivalent to America now. So it's the first time higher education comes with the prospect of very heavy debt. And I know that I would not have been in a position to have sanctioned that, I mean, both psychically and economically. I don't know if I would have even done an undergraduate if I was 19 now. Maybe I'd have opened a t-shirt stand on Camden Market and become a fabulous entrepreneur. Who knows? I mean, I know there's an entrepreneurial side to my personality, I know that, but you know, I'm not alone in this. You know, it's not finishing school. This is about what skills you need to prepare yourself for adult life, isn't it? I was also feeling in my own professional life sort of a growing sense of rage and despair that so few at the top of organisations seem to be able to manifest a real commitment to the way that creativity is shifting in our digital culture, and a real commitment to respond to the needs and behaviours of creative culture. And I think on a personal level, it was a real worry for me that if I stayed working full-time, aligned with specific institutions, that it would be really difficult for me to stay honest while I'm in situations that I think are increasingly dishonest. I mean, they may not be actively dishonest, but they are dishonest if they're not facing up to the creative climate. I've watched and I've listened to all of the undergraduates I've taught in the last 8 months. And I think and I hope I sense your relief that we can frame a very real and empowering discourse about photography that does not centre on the tail end of an old narrative of a discipline in a new art market context, none of which serves us well. Before it gets too depressing, I'll tell you some books that have really helped me out. So in 2012, let's see, where am I? Yeah, 2012, my therapist recommended this book. I think he used to be an actor, so he recommended a book by Peter Brook, who's a theatre director, amazing man, most associated with Shakespeare. And in 1968, he wrote 4 lectures, which were about really the consequences of what was happening within theatre at that point. And the first lecture is called The Deathly Theatre, and it's really about what's at stake if theatre continued to become like this academic sort of heritage industry where only professors laughed at the jokes in Shakespeare at performances. Like, he was saying that's not going to be a good thing, and that's actually the responsibility of those who love theatre to really make sure that the life of theatre isn't lost. And then the final lecture is called The Empty Space, which is about his own practice, and he's talking about the research, the rigor, the rehearsals, and everything that he would do prior to a performance, and then putting all of that aside to create the empty space for theatre to truly happen. And I think because I come from, you know, a working model, like I've always worked, for me that's a really profound thing to have somebody spell out where the real creativity is. I'm not an artist. I have spaces of intellectual freedom late at night when I'm writing, and it feels wonderful, but to actually really say, no, look, there is this space which you can reach as an individual, or you can reach as a group aiming for the same thing, which is, it's immaterial how hard it was to get to that point. You have to just put aside that biography of the difficulties of getting to that point, but actually really continue to seek to get to that point. So I loved the way that he wrote about what's at stake, but also really in a very deeply human way about what creativity is. The second writer who was really influential for me it's her writing, but also specifically this book, is Katherine Hayles, who's a comparative media academic. And she wrote this book for MIT, it's called a pamphlet called Writing Machines, which is about the rise of hyper and cybertext. So it's looking at literature in a digital, what happened to literature in a digital era. And she writes it in 3 different voices. She writes quite a plain but very, very useful overview on the factors that have shaped the emergence of cybertext and hypertext. She writes also as a connoisseur and says it's this body of work, and it's this body of work, and it's this body of work that you need to look at. And then for the third voice, she actually creates a fictional character. And she says the reason it's a fictional character is because she's trained in academia, and so she can't write in an autobiographical way. The two seem far too distant from each other. But I loved the way that she maps out intelligently a complex subject, but one that has to be viewed from more than one perspective. And then the third book, sort of lesser so, but I think it sort of triggered something for me, is a book by Charles Ledbetter called We Think. The book is about kind of collective thinking in a digital era, but the way that he published the book was to create the first manuscript and then put it online, and I think he had about 6 months where he was in conversation with anyone who wanted to be in conversation with him. So the final form of the book was one which had already undergone that sort of discursive phase, and it seemed to be the beginning. For me, it was definitely the beginnings of thinking about whether books could be both true to that analog idea of something that you'll keep for a long time, but equally something that represents an iterative process. I made this drawing in January 2013, and I am leaving my pretty drawing in this presentation, and I'll continue to do so until I've really begun to cross this vast terrain which exists between this drawing and the real work and then the final book. So I recognise that it looks like a drawing that a 12-year-old would do. I truly recognise that, and that's another reason why I leave it in my presentations, really, as a declaration that most of us have very humble starting points for very good reasons. Our simplest ideas are often the best and the most enduring, and they are necessarily human scale. But let me try and explain this drawing. You'll see that you've got this kind of slightly spinal tap, Stonehenge sort of circle of rectangles. And those are my analog chapters, my 6 PDFs. And inside, you've got lots of bubbles, and outside you've got some stars. So let me tell you about the Stonehenge. The book, which will come out slowly over 2015, will have 6 areas of long-form text, single-authored text, where I try, like Katherine Hayles, to write something really useful about all the factors that relate to these 6 ideas about photography. I think the best thing that could be said for my V&A curatorial training is that it gave me the responsibility to take an overview position. And that's the vantage point that I trained in. And even though I'm scared of, I mean, it's almost laughable, me writing about all of these things, but it's not in as much as I think I know how to do it. And I think it would be really useful for the 22-year-old me or 22-year-old student to actually just think about these as actually very living, breathing, and salient ideas about photography. The behaviour of each PDF, which will just go out online, I think there's sort of two main aspects to it. So the sort of lower run is very much the Charles Ledbetter model, which is what comes back to me that I didn't know was going to come back to me from putting these PDFs. Who wants to have a conversation with me? Who wants to critique it? And then how do I respond to that? How do I respond to the responses that I get from a PDF? I also see the PDFs as my calling cards to have conversations with other people, to say, look, this is what I am bringing to the table. What can we discover together, converse about together? You know, meet me halfway, have a conversation. And I see the book very much as containing those are the bubbles, which are really all of these things that sort of bounce around and sort of just refine and bring that text together. I think there's also sort of short texts, other short texts. So you've got the conversations that will come from the PDFs. I think anecdotes are really, really good. You know, just the things that you overhear and the things that you remember and think, oh, it's not going to be like that for much longer. So I've started writing a few anecdotes. I think lists are good as well. Like some things I don't want to write a full essay on, but I would very happily write 10 reasons why this has happened, or this person got a show, or this didn't happen. I have some angry letters in me, as you can probably tell, and it's sort of like, dear Dean of the Art School, dear Director of the Museum. And the responses to responses, and I can't remember what I really meant by texter's guides. I'm terribly sorry. It seemed very clever at the time. So that's photographic. So next spring, expect these PDFs to start coming out, and then I would hope by the end of the year to be laying out a textbook. I don't know who the publisher is. I don't even know if one will need a publisher in the same way as I have done in future years. I quite like the idea of having a publisher and having a book that sort of ends up having a shelf life. As you know, an Amazon book or a Barnes & Noble book has a shelf life of 3 months, and I'd quite like to have a book that has a shelf life that's a bit longer than that. So this is the other project, Photography is Magic. And as often the way for me, the title often comes quite early on, and I just think it's both very, very effortless, that title, and it's also really, really complex to think about what that could mean right now. I've used this title before. I used it for a biennial I curated in South Korea a couple of years ago. It was the first time that I'd had a really substantial space. It was 20,000 square foot of space, and it was also outside of an institution which I was working for full time. So that allowed me, a certain sense of freedom, which I don't think you do feel when you work for the institution that you're curating. This is just the first room, an installation by Carter Mull, which was on metallic sheets, which just reflected up beautifully into the room. So you had to literally walk onto the photographic material in the first room. One of the artists who came out for the installation said that the exhibition was the closest that he'd seen to my own personal taste. And I don't actually agree with him. It made me very uncomfortable when he said that, because I think that most of my career has been from this very enormously privileged position of working in museums where it's way beyond my personal taste. I don't buy photographs. I don't have photographs on the walls. It's not really the point. You're in a position, when you work in an institution, you have to take this overview. But I would say that he was responding to the fact that I was less bridled by the conditions and the politics and the conventions of museums when doing this biennial, and including 30 artists and putting artists' work directly in conversation with somebody unexpected and creating this very sort of animated sense. And I think that what Daegu, the biennial, did for me was allowed me to think in a very ambitious way. And certainly the book, Photography is Magic, is an ambitious book. I'm going to run through some of the slides now so you get a sense of some of the artists that I'm interested in. Eventually there'll be about 75 artists in the book. And obviously I'm choosing just one image to indicate their practice, which, given the rapidity of creative practice right now, even in the last few months, new things have happened. So there's not a single approach here, obviously, but for me, they're all making what I think of as a photographic headway. Their practices will define the routes that the photographic will take, the foundations for what will happen next, and who will flourish within the specific field of photography as contemporary art. I've shown this slideshow to the undergrads, some of whom spoke tonight, and I think maybe the selection seemed pretty obvious to an undergrad, that this is where it's really happening. It seemed to be what you're looking at, and many of you are talking about. Photography is Magic book is being very intentionally edited and written by me and designed by someone called Harsh Patel, who's based in LA, and published by, yes, I know, all the wrong words, right? And published by Aperture to be what I'm calling a trade book. And what I mean by that is a book which is published in quite large numbers. As you know, many of you know, what's happened to publishing is, the trade has been the endangered species of photo publishing. And many of us have worked on lots of books which have print runs of 1,000 or 2,000, and we could pretty much make a list of all the bookstores who are going to stock it. And that's all fine. That is part of our creative ecosystem at the moment. But Photography is Magic, for me, I want it to be a trade book. I want it to be the book that an 18-year-old who's really into photography gets for Christmas, or that you check out of the library in your first semester at college. I want it to look like and operate as a physical, definite, a general rather than a niche confirmation of what many of us who study contemporary art photography recognize as the gestures that have already shifted up the practice and theory of photography. It's a good sign that this creative momentum has been shaped by practitioners and actually ahead of how institutions in the market, how they're going to respond to them. Practitioners are leading this aspect of photography. If I push myself to articulate what, for me, constitutes photography is magic, it's this: that every one of them is using photography as a material, one that may channel the medium's histories in pointed and timely ways, but is still a material and not a discipline. And it is a locative material at that. It's capable of being within, outside, between artistic authorship. Authorship can be dispersed and repositioned within the many active choices that practitioners make in the selection and rendering of a photographic idea. Actually, my language has to be so specific at the moment. It's like so precisely in the words. Essentialist ideas of photography are at play but they are multiple and realised through the iterative, layered, rapid and additive behaviour of the very broad contemporary image-making environment that we're in. These artists aren't creating arty photographs that illustrate our media ecology. Not really interested in that. But they have found positions to operate as artists within that ecology. Their very current practices and theorizations of the photographic set up new possibilities for art, I think. This is my final slide. It's my favourite slide. I hope you appreciate I've chosen a very suitable background for my word unfinishedness, which I'm sure some of you might recognise as a wonderful word that Paulo Freire uses in Pedagogy of Freedom to essentially describe the state of being a human being. And so unfinishedness and knowing that is what I want to deeply thank the CCA students who are coming to my classes for enabling me to truly know and feel at this stage. There have been many times in the past months where I have sat and listened and watched an idea as it sort of circulates around the room. It's the most beautiful thing, you know, it's like it's a shared authorship of an idea. Paulo Freire says that the human condition of unfinishedness is about being conscious of our conditioning, but to know that we can go beyond it. So thank you very much, CCA students, for helping me go beyond that.